Hi, it is Jo from Minerva, and today I am in the world of prom dressmaking, so I am using some slightly challenging fabrics. If you're looking to stretch your making to a big event garment, then you might be looking at some very different fabrics to the ones that you normally sew. Today I'm using a tulle with beading on, and it does require some different skills. So as I make the skirt part of this evening dress, I'm going to show you some of the little skills that I've picked up along the way. This is a butterick pattern, which was actually for stretch knits, but I didn't realise that my daughter had chosen a stretch knits pattern. So we made a few adaptations. So there is a split at the back to get it on and off, and we did a lining so that we could enclose the neck seam and the arm seam without using stretchy bindings. It already had an elasticated waist, and that fits her fine, but we're going to make a tulle and bead skirt overlay to go over the top of the basic dress. If you go and explore some of our bridal fabrics or evening dress fabrics, you might find some very different types. So this was the fabric that my daughter chose for her prom dress. It's a tulle, it's quite heavy, it's got beads and sequins in those motifs there, but it also has the added bonus of this absolutely stunning hem. So it's got a sort of guipure lace edging, scallop edging, and loads of beading. I let my daughter choose it from the website, but I knew that I would need to look up some special techniques for sewing beaded fabric. All of the fabrics and the products that I use are listed below, so if there's something there specific that you might need, you will find it there. First of all, let's go and look how we cut out this fabric. We want to make sure that we're not damaging any of our equipment. So I'm going to show you on the cutting table how I cut out this rather unusual fabric. I'm at the cutting stage of this beaded tulle. So I'm going to show you a few tips. I've got it so that the beads are on the inside, but I can see where they are by the pattern repeat. It's quite a heavy fabric, it's really heavy and drapey, so I'm going to support the weight either on the table, or I've just put a chair by the side of the table so I can take the weight without the fabric slipping off. I'm using lace pins, and I'm pinning them right within the seam allowance so that I'm not marking or catching any of the threads. You can cut this a couple of different ways. I wouldn't recommend using your very best dressmaking scissors, because if you catch the sequins or the beads, that's your scissors dead for your next project. I'm just using a really good pair of sort of all-purpose scissors. It cuts through the tulle fine, but if I catch any of those beads, it doesn't matter. Also, you can use a rotary cutter, because you can cut with that, and if you deaden the blade, you can throw the blade away and get a new blade in ready for your next project. I'm cutting this fabric, but I would like to use the border here as part of my hem. The problem is this skirt piece is cut on the fold and it scoops away. So I can't get this straight border to have a curved edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the tulle. I'm going to take off this piece of border and add it as an applique. And I'll show you how to do that when I get to that stage in the video. So the first thing to do is to cut my piece, and I'm going to cut here and try and avoid the beads if you can. But if you do catch one, have an unpicker to hand so that you can just unpick the thread and pull the beads away. And it's a slightly messy business, because as you cut your fabric pieces and you cut through the threads that are holding the beads together, your beads will fall off the fabric design. So if you've got small people around your feet, good idea to clear up straight away. If you have any notches or placements for waistbands, etc., you can mark those. It's harder with a tulle because you've not got anything really to mark with a chalk or anything. So I'm just going to put a little tailor's tack in that seam allowance and one in the other side where there's no design left, it's just the tulle. Remove the pins and then we can take a look at our seam allowances. Now that you've got your fabric cut out, you will need to start thinking about how you're going to take some of those beads out so that you can sew it. So the next part of the video will show you how to thread baste your seams and remove the beads within the seam allowance. There are a couple of different ways of doing this. You can use an unpicker. Some people use a hammer, so they mark, thread baste the seam line and then tap the beads with a hammer and smash them off. It just feels all kinds of wrong to me. I'd rather unpick them all. I don't want bits in my carpet, bits on the table. I don't want any little bits to drop down the throat plate on my machine and give me some mechanical problems with my sewing machine. So it's very, very, I'm not going to say tedious, it's very, very time consuming, but to pick them off with an unpicker is a much safer way to remove the beads in the seam line. I pop a podcast on, grab a cup of tea. Okay, we need to take off the beads and the sequins that are in the seam allowance because, as we mentioned before, it's going to damage our machine. So the thing we need to do is to find out where our seam line is going to be so that we keep the beads on the garment that we'll be showing and we remove the ones that are inside the seam allowance because they also can be quite uncomfortable against your skin. So I'm using a red tacking thread. It's tricky to see. But I'm just using my 1.5 centimetre seam allowance and making a thread trace, it's called, or thread baste along this seam line, and then I've got a guide to pull out my beads. The good thing about removing your beads with an unpicker is that you have a little selection of beads to use to put back on at the end if you want to enhance any areas, or maybe some of your beads are just starting to run off a little bit. If you've not smashed them with a hammer and you've taken them off carefully, then you can reuse the beads. So for this job you need an unpicker and a really short needle, the shortest one that you can find, because you'll only have very short threads to pull through. So I've done here, so here's my thread tracing line, and I've taken the little pearl out of there and the pearl out of there, and I've got enough room with my sewing machine foot to get past that little sequin section there, so I'm going to leave that. I've got some little seed beads here, and I'm just going to pull them away from the seam allowance so that I can keep the threads long. If you snip, you can snip with little scissors, but if you snip, you've got a chance that you might catch your fabric, and also you'll be making the threads really short and you won't be able to tie them in at the back. Once you get a little run of them, they sort of all keep coming then. And you won't be able to tie all of the threads in because some of them will be too short, but you want to try and tie a few so that you don't get that complete run back that will release all of these. If you can pull them like this, then you'll get some nice long threads. Okay, when you've got a long thread like this one, then you can start to pull it through to the back and you keep it really long. It gets longer and longer the more you can just keep that one thread going. I'm happy that that little section is now clear, and I'm going to thread my needle and pull the short thread through to the back. If I didn't pull this thread through, then you can see that this seed bead here is starting to make its way up the thread, so I'm going to tie that little section off. And this is where a short needle comes in handy, because you can go through the loop. Okay, moving on to the next one, dragging the seed beads out to the edge, and that's so then I can see where the long thread is. Here, this flower is going to be in the way of my machine, so I'm going to have to take out half of that. If you don't think you've got the patience to tie off all of these loose threads, then you can just make sure that they're going out towards the seam allowance, so that when you run your stitch line over this red line, you will be catching all of those little threads inside the seam allowance. It's quite time consuming. It's one of those things you put the radio on, grab a mug of tea and just enjoy the process. It's good if you can keep tidy, keep your beads all in a dish. If they're all over the floor, it's a little bit, you'll find them for weeks and weeks and weeks. Okay, so you've done your thread tracing, you've removed your beads. If you've got any loose threads, try and keep those heading out towards the seam allowance so that they get caught in this seam. And you're going to match up those thread tracing lines. I'm back to the lace pins, and you might find that you need to put your pins in and out and in and out a couple of times so that they don't slip out of tulle. You can be feeling with your fingers if you've got any spare beads that need to be taken off as you go along, and then we can take a seam line down here. Let's take a look at how we're going to sew the seams together. To sew, I'm going to take my regular foot off. You can either use an adjustable zipper foot or a zipper foot where you can put your needle either side, and that helps you just to get past any of the beads that are still on the right side of your stitch line. So for example, I've got some there, so I want to make sure that my foot isn't rocking over that bead. I'm not going to go forwards and back. If you back tack tulle, it just gets sucked down into the throat plate. And I've changed the stitch length to 2 because the shorter your stitch, the less it will pucker up. The sort of inclination is to make your stitch length long so that it gets past all of this tricky stuff, but actually you need a really small stitch length so that it doesn't chew up the fabric. I'm going to follow just inside my basting line so that that's easy to pull out afterwards. And I'm going to use a pair of long nose pliers just to make sure any of these loose threads that I couldn't tie off are coming across the seam line. Because I've done my thread basting in a different colour, it's easy to pull that out. So you pull that out. I did a different colour for each side. And I'm just left with my single stitch line. It's best not to press this fabric at all, even on a light setting. It's best to finger press with your fingers and press the seams open. I like to hand sew all of the finished edges down. It's again very time consuming. It's a real couture technique, but to hold the edges down with a little overcast stitch is better than trying to get it through your overlocker and maybe damaging that with a rogue bead that you didn't manage to get rid of. So it's quite hard for me to show you because sewing with an invisible thread in tulle is impossible to film and actually quite boring to watch. So I've just finished the edge of that seam there, just that section. And you can see on the inside, it's not flapping, it's attached down each side. And from the right side, it's a very ethereal, thin seam finish. You can see higher up where I haven't done it, when the two sides go to one side, you get this sort of thicker area. But if I can split that and spread that embroidery out, then it just looks like part of the embroidery from the right side. So that's a pretty couture finish, and it's very slow going, but it's an absolutely beautiful seam finish. Visible. If you want to go back, take some of your beads, you can fill in any of these if it's particularly poignant, maybe on a bodice. You might want to put some of the pearls back on. This is the side of a skirt, so I'm okay with just a few beads missing along the side. It's not changing that overall motif. So this is the hem of my dress, and because it curves, I want to put this hem border onto this piece of fabric. So I'm going to cut into the tulle. I'm going to cut it not too close to the edge because I want to give myself some handling and pinning room. But I'm just taking off the border motif. And I'll just show you the concept because it takes quite a long time to put it on, but I'll just show you. And then you can add your border to the edge of your skirt, and you can position it where you want to, so you can get that thicker bit to fill in the gaps if you want, so you have bigger areas of beading, and pin it in with lace pins, and then you can sew it on. Now if you had just a flat lace without beads, you can zigzag that on with a very good matching thread or an invisible thread, but I'm going to hand sew it on because I've got all beads in here and I don't want to take those off because that's going to spoil the reason I bought the fabric. So I'm going to hand sew that border onto the curved hem of the skirt. When I've done that, I can then go back and take off any of this extra fabric, any of this extra tulle that's taking away from the design. So that's how you manipulate a border to go onto a curved hem. Obviously, if you've got straight skirt pieces, you can just match it straight up with your fabric when you cut out your skirt pieces in the first instance. You can use an invisible thread or a very good matching thread, and when you attach the hem on, it's quite precarious because you'll keep catching your thread on beads, but you just need to do a tiny little back stitch. I'm keeping my stitch line in the embroidery because actually I tried it with an invisible thread and I just couldn't see it and it kept catching on the beads, so I'm going to use a back stitch to attach the beads around here. I'm going to work all the way around. If there's any places where the beads need to be just re-secured, like here, I'm just going to go over them because that's been cut. There's a couple there, but you will get quite a few little snags, so you just have to stop, go back and re-pull your thread through. And it is important, if you are using a bordered edge beaded lace, that you do the hem in this way, especially if you're not massively sure how it's going to hang, because if you cut this skirt using the border and then when the person tried it on it was too short, there's nothing you can do about it. If it was too long, you wouldn't be able to turn it up because you would be taking away the scallop. You'd have to take it up from the top. So this border is a great way of making the skirt, finding the length that you want, and then putting the border where you need it so you get exactly the right hem length, and you would get the person who's going to wear it to try it on with the shoes they're going to wear on the night that they're going to wear it. If you are adding beads to the top of a dress, there's a couple of things to be mindful of right back at your choosing stage, which is it's really uncomfortable to wear an evening dress with beads under your arm there. So sometimes that can be quite uncomfortable for some people. It can rub quite a sore patch on the inside of your arm. So that is why I have made the skirt as an overlay. So we get to use the beautiful beaded fabric, but it's on the bottom of the skirt. If you are using a lace or a lightly beaded lace, you can use that on a bodice, but you might want to use a different technique where you overlap some of the motifs, and that's called an applique seam, and I'll show you how to do that. If you're working with beaded lace on a bodice and you want to keep the continuation of the pattern going, then you can do a seam finish called an applique seam. So I have a line here marking the cut line of my fabric. I'm just using a couple of sample pieces here because I don't want to cut any more of this lace if I don't use it. So you have the cut line here, but when you cut your fabric, you're going to cut around the applique. So this piece we're going to take away. So we could be matching up all of the appliques, but I've only got a couple available on my fabric. So what we're looking for is this design to be in the correct place, and this design is now filling in that hole where there would have been nothing, and then the next one would have been here, sort of thing. So what you do is you cut out your cut line and you cut around the motifs, and then you thread trace the seam line. So if the seam line is 1.5 centimeters, you make a thread trace line to indicate where that would be. It's temporary, you're going to pull that out afterwards, but you do that for the length of your seam. It's quite a couture finish, so it takes a long time. You do the same on the other piece of fabric, because you're going to match up these two thread lines, and that will be your guide for sewing. I haven't measured this and it's not massively accurate, it's just to show you how the technique works. And now you're going to put your fabric right sides together and match up those thread tracing lines. And with your unpicker, you're going to take out any beads in this section between the appliques. So I'll probably leave that bit with beads in, but I'll take out the beads in there and the beads in there, and then we're going to sew between the applique sections on the sewing machine. And then you pull out the thread tracing. If it's tulle, just be careful you're not pulling on the tulle. A basting thread is good because it's really soft. This isn't basting thread, but if I was making a handmade garment I would. So there's the sewing up to the applique either side, and then when you open up the seam allowance, the applique that you kept can then be flipped out and matched on top of the other shape that you would like to keep. So instead of that being cut, you've got the whole shape on top. You can layer them up as well, and you've still got the seam running here. You can open that seam out like I did on the skirt to make it finer, like that there. And then what you're left with is a little bit of hand sewing. If it's just a lace fabric, you can zigzag around here on the machine, but because it's beaded and we want to keep the beads because that's an integral part of the reason we've chosen this fabric, then you keep it as it is, and you just have to manipulate the tulle to release the applique. And you get it flat, and you don't want double beads there, so you take out the beads from underneath, put your applique on top, and then I would hand sew that down with invisible thread, and then trim away any of this spare tulle. I've got applique scissors so that I don't catch any of the beads or other parts of the fabric. You could trim it down a little bit before you start sewing if you like. Depends how much fabric you need for your hand stitching. And that is how you make an appliqued seam. It is a couture dressmaking technique. It does take a lot of time, a lot of hand sewing and a lot of patience. But if you want a beaded bodice to a dress rather than a beaded skirt, then you'll be needing to make sure that you keep those seam allowances correct. That's why you have to do the thread basting. Applique seams are best used for a bodice because you're looking to not have seam lines running in very prominent places on your top. Again, it's quite time consuming, but if you're choosing this lace, it's because you love sewing and you love to try out some different techniques. I hope that's helped you, whether you're in the world of wedding sewing or if you're in prom zone like I am at the moment. Then if you know a few techniques, it might help you to choose the correct fabric or to stretch yourself and choose a fabric that you wouldn't normally sew with. We would love to see what you've been making, so do make an account with us, share your makes, and we'd like to see what fabric you've chosen, which pattern you've paired it with. That's really interesting to us and all of our sewing community. Thank you very much for watching. Do call again soon.